Okay, I think we can start, I guess. My name is Leelde. Hello, everyone. Me and my colleague Stefan will moderate this session today. Happy to see you in this busy time. I know that a lot of you guys are overwhelmed with exams, and so thanks again for joining and all the luck in exams. Today's speaker is PhD candidate Drummond McCulloch from Denmark. Drummond works at the Neurobiological Research Unit, Rigshospitalet, Copenhagen University Hospital, and he has a background in drug design and pharmacology, and now works as a PhD fellow at the Neurobiology Research Unit, Copenhagen, where he is supervised by Professors Patrick Fisher and Gitte Moos Knudsen. There, Drummond coordinates clinical trials using functional MRI, EEG, and PET scan to evaluate the acute and persisting effects on psilocybin and LSD on the brain. His topic he will say himself. And the floor is yours, Drummond.
Thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks everyone for coming out during exam season. I don't think any of this is going to be examinable. So I'm going to be talking today about the entropic brain hypothesis and then our attempt to really try and work out whether that makes sense in the context of psychedelics and as a way of explaining or discovering a neural correlate of the acute effects of psychedelics. I don't know how these normally work. I really don't like sitting there and not understanding things when there's presentations. So if you guys have the same idea, and I will be talking about some concepts that can maybe be a little bit challenging. So please feel free to put your hand up, and hopefully Stefan can grab you and unmute you guys, because I don't want people to be too lost. But at the same time, this is sort of like we're just trying to have a good time and hear about some interesting psychedelic science. It's obviously not a lecture, right? So just to lay all that out. But I'm Drummond McCulloch. I work in this lab in Copenhagen, and I'm going to be talking about this entropic brain thing. So the persisting effects of psychedelics are very cool, and the medicalization is very cool, and we're all a big fan of it. But what I'm really going to be talking about today are the acute effects of psychedelics, which are also very cool and have inspired a lot of great art, like this Alex Grey painting. And this is a quote from one of our participants from this study that I'm going to be talking about. We collected a lot of qualitative data, which I won't be talking about in this presentation, but this woman said, the light of love brings clarity to everything. I get a deep feeling of purity and feel that everything is beautiful and that love is what makes up the world and the universe and connects everything like a network of roots. And I assume she felt a little bit like this painting on the right. And what we're really trying to work out here is these seem like really profound acute drug effects. And we want to know what's happening in the brain in order for someone to have these sort of feelings. Yes. Okay, so that's concept one. Psychedelics have acute effects, and those are interesting. Concept two is this idea of entropy. So we can think of entropy as a descriptive word that doesn't really have a unit or anything, that sort of describes how disordered, how random, or how unpredictable a system is. And you can quantify it in a number of different mathematical ways, which I'm going to go through. But within the context of brain activity, people who are under anesthetic or in a coma or in deep sleep seem to have decreased brain entropy as measured in a wide range of different ways. If you have a high dose of caffeine, it seems to increase your brain entropy. So there's something here about sort of wakefulness state arousal. There's something going on there. People with ADHD, this is one early report, but seem to have reduced brain entropy just at rest. People with affective disorders, some populations have increased brain entropy, some populations have decreased brain entropy. In Parkinson's, there's a decrease. And then salvia divinorum, which is some sort of dissociative hallucinogen. I don't know if I'd call it a psychedelic. It's a very powerful psychoactive drug, also seems to increase a measure of brain entropy. So there's a bit of a background in the field here as to what brain entropy looks like, and you can sort of see this picture starting to emerge of what brain entropy might represent. But let's zoom in a little bit more on what we actually mean when we say entropy. So this paper, I recommend everyone actually reads it. It's the basis of all information and all computing, by this guy Claude Shannon, called A Mathematical Theory of Communication. I think it has like 140,000 citations, which is really bonkers. Anyway, he describes, he's the first person to describe information formally. And one measure of, and entropy is a sort of measure of how much information there is in a system. Yeah. Or how complex that system is, where complexity is synonymous with information density. So he formalized it with this equation here, which effectively just says, take a histogram, which is just a measure of the number of counts of a thing, and then see what the probability is of each of those things, and then sort of take the width of that histogram. So just as an example, if we look at a histogram, a probability histogram of the weather in Denmark, on any given day, there's about a 20% chance it's going to snow or be sunny or rainy or cloudy or breezy, right? So this histogram is very flat, and so it has a high entropy. This, intuitively also, it's just the entropy of the weather in Denmark is high, right? Whereas if we look at the weather in, say, California, there's like a 90% chance it's going to be sunny, and then it might be cloudy or a little bit rainy some days. And this is a low entropy system. And you can sort of intuit that something that's very chaotic, changes a lot, unpredictable is a high entropy system, whereas something which is very stable is a very low entropy system. So effectively what you do is you look at the probabilities and you see how wide a histogram is, and that's the measure. But where the information is not relevant to this, and that's important. So if they had the same probabilities, but it was a 90% chance of it snowing, say in Lapland, and then the other probabilities were the same, that would have the same entropy, but it would be a different system. And that's quite important, that entropy only measures the distribution of the probabilities and not where those probabilities actually are. Okay, hopefully that's all right. So on to our research. So this is a plot of, for on the x-axis, we have time after people have been administered psilocybin, and this is within a scanning environment. And then on the y-axis, we have their subjective drug intensity. We just go on the intercom to them and we say, hey, how are you doing? How intense, out on a scale from 0 to 10, would you say your drug experience is at the moment? And so we can see that we're giving people high doses of psilocybin here. That's the first thing that sort of jumps out. Most people are hitting a 10 at some point in terms of their intensity. And then these drug effects last about 6 hours, 5 or 6 hours, 300 minutes, right? We also perform fMRI brain scans. So this measures brain activity by looking at oxygenation in the brain. I'm not going to go into that, but just generally, we're looking at fMRI here. We're looking at brain blood flow or brain blood oxygenation. And we take a scan before we give the drug, and then we take 4 scans during the drug effects. And with each of those scans, we also ask them, like I say, what is the your subjective drug intensity? And we take a plasma sample of blood, which we can use to measure the amount of psilocybin, or the psilocin, actually, that's in the blood. So we're taking a scan, a subjective measure, and a blood measure of the drug. And we do this multiple times throughout the study. Yes, so one slide that I'm missing here, which would be maybe nice for me to demonstrate, is that this entropic brain theory of psychedelic drug action, actually, you know what, I do have it, it's just here, has been evaluated previously 12 times. But the crazy thing about this is that although 12 studies have independently evaluated psychedelic effects on brain entropy, every single one of them has done it different. So they've all used a totally different quantification of brain entropy. And we can see generally that people have shown increases, but it's very important that these things are calculated differently. And we also have to remember this thing called publication bias, where positive results are much more likely to get published than null findings. And so there's definitely been something going on here, but we'll get into that. The other thing worth noting is that most of these have been performed on this LSD and psilocybin IV data sets that came out of Imperial. So a lot of these, that's just to say that a lot of these are performed on the same data set. Yes. So we looked at these 12 different papers and these 12 different metrics, and we thought to ourselves, well, that seems interesting, and there really seems to be some sort of effect here where psychedelics are associated with increases in brain entropy. What we wanted to do was evaluate all 12 of these different metrics, but on our data. And the second thing that makes our study sort of an expansion of the previous field is that all of these studies thus far have compared either a before drug and one after drug, and then just seen whether there's a difference between those two things, or they've compared a placebo with the drug and then just seen if there's a difference with one scan. So what we have is this multiple scan design, and we have these plasma drug levels. So they can just do an A-B comparison, and then we do a correlation between the drug effects and the brain entropy. So that was the idea behind this whole process, that there's these 12 papers out there. We wanted to see whether these results replicated when we do it in a more robust fashion. Hope everyone sort of follows. Okay, so I mentioned that there's a lot of different ways in which to estimate brain entropy. And I like to group them into these three different categories of static connectivity, dynamic connectivity. So where static connectivity we can think of as like a structure. So in this case, I'm saying, you know, these towers they build in the north of Spain, where they like try and stack as many people up, but it's a very rigid structure. But we want to look at the entropy of that. Dynamic connectivity, which you can sort of think as like a dance, where it's moving throughout time, but what we're interested in is how those two things are connected and how that moves throughout time. And then dynamic activity, where we just look at the activity within any given region, which I think of as like a solo dancer, and how they move over the course of the scan. Okay, so what I thought would be best is not to go through every single one of these 12 different metrics and how they all break down and all the silly technical details behind that, but I wanted to just go into each one and give us a bit of an example, a bit of a conceptual example of how we can estimate entropy from the brain signal. So I don't actually know if you guys know much about fMRI or you get taught about fMRI. Can I get like some indication? Is that possible? I can't really see. We got some thumbs and maybe some concerned looking people. Cool, nice. Okay, so just very quickly, fMRI gives you a three-dimensional image of the brain at every time point. So you get an image of how much activity there is effectively at time point A, and then again at time point B, and then at time point C, and so on and so forth. And so you get what's called a time series of activity. You can then parcellate that out and just say, okay, we're here about the activity within the front left, right, of the brain, and then you get a time series of activity over the course of your scan, say it's 10 minutes for that brain region. Right. So when we're calculating these static connectivity metrics, basically this is how it goes. You parcellate out your regional time series, so you have a time series for each brain region. You then calculate the correlation, which is just a standard Pearson's correlation between the signals in all of those different brain regions to try and get an estimate of to what degree those brain regions sort of fluctuate together or are not at all connected. And then you get this thing. I don't know if you can see my mouse, Lella, can you?
I can't, but maybe it's my vision.
There's a thing, right, for this, but I can't seem to find it. Okay, well, you can see that there's this sort of...
I see it. Yeah,
Oh, you can? Okay. I'll try and like move it around real dramatically. So you can see this region by region connectivity matrix where we just have 100 and something regions and we see how correlated they are with each other. What we then do is we make this into like a graph where we say, okay, this region here is connected to this region, but not this one, but it is connected to this one and not to this one, and so on and so forth. So you get a sort of map which describes which regions are connected to which other regions. Then we say, okay, how many regions is each region connected to? and we plot that as a histogram. So say there's like 50 regions which are connected to 40 other regions, and there's 10 which are connected to 39 other regions, and there's 8 which are connected to 38 other regions, something like this. And you get this histogram, and then we can do that Shannon entropy width of the histogram thing. So what we're really conceptually measuring here is how distributed is the connectivityness across the brain. And this is just one measure. And if that seems like a sort of like random way of evaluating brain entropy, you're not alone. Like, this is kind of the point we're trying to make with this paper, is that a lot of these metrics, while they're fine and they seem to make sense, are like a little bit just sort of pulled out of the air. And so this is one of them. And it's not to criticize specifically this one. It is as fine as all of the others in a lot of ways. But it's just to say that there's this massive heterogeneity within the field at the moment, wherein no one's really agreeing on exactly what we mean when we say something like brain entropy. Yeah, is that a hand? No, good, it's just a jumper. Okay, so we did this and we looked at it and we saw whether this entropy correlated with the plasma drug levels. That's just what I'm going to show you in this one. It doesn't really. And so this is an example of where someone else has shown there to be a finding in a different data set. We have tried to do it again. We've tried to use exactly the same methods. We even sent our code to the original author and said, hey, is this what you did? And they said, yeah, pretty much. Or hopefully, yeah, exactly. And then we do the analysis, and it turns out that there's no real effect. Okay, so I mean, null findings are by their nature a little bit less sexy than like finding findings, but I still think they're very important. Okay, so the next category is dynamic connectivity. And so in this case, instead of just looking at how associated those brain regions are over the entire scan, what we do is we look at how connected those brain regions are across the scan, and how the connectivity between those regions changes over the course of the scan. So this is like the dance between each of these regions. So again, we take our brain scan, we take our series, our string of cubes, where cubes are brain images, and we get these time series. We get a time series for every brain region, but then we use some fancy maths, which I'm not going to go into, to calculate the instantaneous correlation between each pair at each time point. So we can say that in the first 2 seconds, region A and region B are correlated 0.5, but then in the 2 seconds after that, they're not correlated at all. And then in the 2 seconds after that, they're correlated more, and so on and so forth. And so you get a sort of a time series of the correlation. And then you can plot that as a histogram, where you can see the histogram here, where now we're looking at a histogram of how much does the correlation between these two brain regions change over time. So it's looking at how dynamic the correlation is between those two brain regions, right? And then we get this for every single combination of brain regions. So we end up with this on the bottom right, where we get an entropy score for each. An edge is just the association between two brain regions, right? Yes, and then what we can do is we can group these into networks. So we can say these regions all at the back here, all part of the visual network. So we kind of just take a mean of all of those entropies, and we see whether the entropy within each network is associated with with plasma drug levels. So this was actually, I think, our strongest finding. And the curious thing here is that the previous publication didn't even they looked at persisting effects. We're looking at acute effects, so we can't really compare. But we show really robust associations, especially in these. I don't know if you guys know much about brain networks. Sorry, I realize that's a whole thing. So brain activity, I don't know. Can I get like some sort of thumb show of like whether people know what like brain networks are, default mode, executive control, all these things? Oh, okay, sick. All right, fine, cool. Is Stefan coming to tell me something, or is he just walking past? Hard to know. No, it's okay. He's just giving me like an extra big thumbs up. That's cool. Okay, so what we see is that the entropy, so like how much the connectivity within these regions changes over the course of the scan, is really associated with the amount of drug that's in the system and how intense people rate their experience to be, especially in these default mode, frontal parietal, and medial frontal brain networks, which are these like top-down, more sort of higher control, sensory combination, like associative networks. Whereas in the sort of motor, subcortical, visual association of visual one, we don't really see much of an effect, although this within subcortical, there's something going on. Yeah. But then also within visual 2, we have this really super strong effect as well. And visual 2 is sort of where visual, it's not your primary visual cortex, it's where there's sort of the association of the visual information and the framing of the visual information. And I think this, I'd love to dig into this finding a little bit more and see if this is associated, this entropy specifically is associated with the closed eye visual effects of psychedelics. Yes, so this is one of our most robust findings, and we're sort of still trying to interpret it. The paper is being written. If anyone has any super hot interpretations of what they think this could mean, that'd be cool. One of the nice things is that this is a replication paper, right? So we don't need to justify our methods, but the fact that we see this finding is particularly curious, and the fact that it's only in these mostly in these associative brain regions is particularly curious. Also because the original author of this told me I shouldn't use his method because he didn't think it would show anything, and that's very rewarding that he was wrong. All right, okay, so on to the third type of brain entropy. So we're looking at dynamic activity here, and in a way this is sort of simpler. It's just we're not looking at the association between brain regions, which can be a little bit difficult to conceptualize because it's so high dimensional. But for when we're looking at just brain activity, we're just looking at a single region of the brain, looking at the scan, and then seeing how entropic is that activity. So I'm going to zoom in on this one called multi-scale sample entropy, which sounds really complex. And to be honest, this slide doesn't make it seem any less complex, but effectively what we're just doing is we're looking at a series, like a motif within that time series, which you can see at the bottom. I can't, pointing at my screen doesn't help at all, does it? This here, we look at a little bit of it, say these 5 here, and we see, okay, are the next 5 similar to that? Yes or no? And then are the next 5 after that similar? Yes or no? And so we're just seeing whether the signal is made up of repeating motifs, whether it's regular, whether it's predictable in its activity. You can ignore all this text on the right. It's overly mathsy. Yes. So we do this over 5 different scales. So at the first scale, we just look at we're effectively looking at the entropy of the signal at a very fine time scale, and then at scale 5, maybe if we can just look at like point number 4 here, you take the first 5 data points, you just take the mean of those, and then you take points 6 through to 10, you take the mean of those, and so you end up with a much shorter time series, and then you just see whether you have a repeating time series there, but then that sort of like smooths out your data, so you look at slow fluctuations as opposed to fast fluctuations in brain activity. So the curious thing with this one is that at the short time frame, so at a very pardon me, at a very fine time scale, what we see is an increase in brain entropy as plasma drug levels and subjective drug intensity go. It's within some of the limbic networks, some of the control circuits, the central visual network, the dorsal attention network. But I mean, these are sort of small effects, but nevertheless, across the brain, we generally see an increase in brain entropy on this very fine time frame. However, at the longer time scales, so where we sort of smooth out the data across time, we see a decrease in brain entropy. So just to put that in the most pedagogical and possibly oversimplified way, this means that the brain signal is more entropic acutely, so it has very fast fluctuations that are very entropic, but the slow features of the brain activity are actually less entropic. So it's more entropic second by second and less entropic. So where scale 1 is approximately 2 seconds, like in 2-second intervals, and scale 5 is approximately 10-second intervals. So at the 2-second time frequency, the brain entropy is increased, but at the 10-second time frequency, the brain entropy is decreased, which I think is interesting. And then possibly even more interesting is that we don't see any effect at sort of 4 and 6 seconds. So there's not really any change in the brain entropy at the sort of medium-ish timeframes, call it what you will. But we do see this increase in short timeframes and a decrease in long timeframes. Again, if you have a super hot interpretation of this data, please let me know. Is that a hand? Sorry, you guys are super tiny on my screen, so I can't really see you.
Yes, yeah, we were muted. We always have to put it on. Yeah, so I mean, not a directed hypothesis, but in general, you have low brain rhythms and training higher frequency activity, right? So do you think it has maybe something to do with the different oscillations at which the networks are communicating, that, for example, like gamma rhythms may be doing something else, and that's why you have this mismatch between like short, medium, and long scale perspectives on it? Or
yeah, so conceptually, I think so. What you're referring to is within EEG, you can do a frequency decomposition to look at alpha, beta, theta, gamma rhythms, but those are at much higher frequencies than this signal. So those are in the region of sort of like 5 to 100 hertz. So 0.2 seconds to 0.001 seconds. Whereas we're looking at the bold signal here, which is the blood oxygenation signal. And that has a much slower rhythm to it than EEG measured brain activity. But you make a great point that what we could start to be seeing here is the fact that the bold signal might also have features that are fast and slow that we haven't really captured thus far. And so by applying that sort of framework from EEG, where we have this idea of alpha and gamma and delta rhythms, we can maybe apply that to the bold and then see that there's a difference between the rapid changes in the rapid activity in the bold signal and slower changes in the bold signal. Did I understand you at all, or if I like totally talked?
Yeah, like I was just out of the top of my mind thinking about different
Yeah.
It's happening at different time scales that can entrain brain activity. EEG oscillation just being one example, but yeah, what you're saying makes sense, like having like a fMRI MEG setup or something like that.
It would be, yeah, what would be super cool, right, is to do simultaneous fMRI EEG. Like, I don't know if you guys saw that most recent DMT paper out of Imperial, and then we could see whether these sort of fast fluctuations are associated with alpha rhythms, or sorry, with gamma rhythms, and the slow fluctuations are associated with alpha rhythms, or something like this. I think simultaneous MR and EEG imaging is going to be a really important tool for uncovering the effects of psychedelics, and also just understanding what each of those signals really mean ultimately. It's very nice to be able to ground something, if not in like truth, in at least a different imaging metric and see whether things are associated, right? Yes, so we see an effect there. So I've sort of gone through each of these groups, the static connectivity, dynamic connectivity, and dynamic activity, one by one to give you an example. I don't know if this is interesting, but so here is like an overview of what all the previous entropy metrics within psychedelics. And you can see that of the static connectivities previously, they saw increases across the board. In dynamic activity, there was also both increases and null findings for all of them. And then for dynamic connectivity, we have these 3 that show these increases, 2 that don't report any findings, and 1 that shows no effect. However, for our findings, we see quite a radically different picture, where in terms of static connectivity, I'm just going to sort of flick back and forth for the sake of contrast here. But for static connectivity, we really see no notable effect, or no effect that I would write home about. And so it seems like the static nature of brain activity, although it is like very reliable that we see decreases in within network connectivity and increases in between network connectivity, this thing that I was saying earlier about the fact that the connectivity histogram can move left and right, but it's the width that matters for entropy is important. So while we definitely see changes in static connectivity, we don't see changes in the entropy of static connectivity. And that's pretty robust for us. In terms of dynamic activity, we kind of echo what was shown previously, and that is encouraging. There's a bit of a funny thing where we show for the multi-scale sample entropy, we show it at a different time scale, and we show this decrease at the long levels that it hasn't been shown in previous papers or in the previous paper. And for the other metric, they show it for LSD but not psilocybin, and we only show it for psilocybin, so it's not technically a replication. But conceptually, there seems to be this increase in the activity within a region. And then for dynamic connectivity, we show no finding for the 3 that actually did show a finding. And last time we show like a really strong no effect. Like you would need like 8,000 scans to show any effect if this is real, right? And then for this one that doesn't, this one that we talked about, with the instantaneous connectivity, we saw this really robust effect, which unfortunately they didn't show any effect. Because they were looking at persisting effects. So that's kind of new. And then with this other one, it's like a brain state based measure. They didn't show an effect and we do. So it's a little messy, right? But ultimately what we're trying to say is, one, it really matters which entropy quantification you use. So when you say psychedelics increase brain entropy, like what do you mean? Like which brain entropy do you mean? And then conceptually, even within that, it's like, okay, but yes, at short time frames, but not at long time frames. So even if you just say, oh, we looked at sample entropy, it's very, very important that you sort of evaluate what metrics you're using, and make sure that that is clearly communicated in your paper. So I think that's pretty much, that's sort of it for this project. I tried to slim it down a little bit, and I have also some slides to talk about some upcoming projects that I'm setting up in the lab that are a little more conceptual and a little less mathsy. But until then, does anyone have any questions or thoughts about this project? Like I say, the paper is still being written, so I'm extremely open to people having sort of ideas about what's up with this and why it might be interesting, or why it's actually just a shitty idea. All in all, I'm also open to that, because yeah, it's better to know now than than to know later.
Can you hear me?
Oh,
You just saw.
hi, nice presentation.
Hi, you're super quiet, man. You're moving.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you know what? I'm just gonna listen really hard.
Maybe to sit a bit lower.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
A very nice presentation. I was just hoping that you could. I had just 2 questions that I had written down, and one is, what's the exact difference between dynamic connectivity and dynamic activity? And the second question is, so entropy or brain entropy, the way you define it, then is it just a quantitative measure that just sees if the brain region is active, like a 0 and 1, and just sees the distribution of the histogram and not exactly how much is it active, or am I missing something here?
Cool. Okay, so the difference between the first one was, what was the difference between dynamic activity and dynamic connectivity, right?
Right.
So when you think about conceptually think about dynamic activity, imagine you're just watching, like, imagine you're watching someone ice skating, right? And you just see them moving around the rink, you see how they move, you see what moves they do, you see the speed they go, where they look, and you just look at that one person and look at what they're doing. That is sort of measuring the dynamic activity. You're looking at a single brain region, and you're looking at how the signal within that brain region changes over time. Now imagine instead of watching a single person ice skating, you're watching a pair doing a figure skating competition, and you look at the interaction between those two individuals while they're skating. So maybe they're like holding one hand and they stretch out and then they move together, and then they're moving up, but one of them is moving down, they're holding each other, something like this. So the dynamic connectivity is more like how two brain regions change in their connectivity, change in their association to each other over the course of the scan. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's like the interaction of two brain regions.
Yeah. So in one case, it's just what is that guy, like what is that brain region doing? And the other one is how is the interaction between those two brain regions changing over time?
Right.
Your second question I didn't quite get. Can you repeat it?
So I was just wondering, like you said, brain entropy is like the distribution of the histogram and not how high different parts of the histograms are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like so is it like just a quantitative measure like of 0 and 1? Is it active or not? Like how many parts of the brains are active? Or is there a qualitative aspect to it also, like the entropy?
Yeah, okay. So I think you're the fact that this isn't super clear to you is very much a reflection of the field. Because I can say to you, yeah. So we're looking at the entropy of like we're looking at the entropy. Entropy is the width of a histogram. We're looking at brain entropy, right? And then people would be like, but wait a second, what are you actually plotting on the histogram, right? Are you plotting brain activity as being like high or low? Are you plotting brain connectivity? And the fact is, it's actually worse than that. It's like it's couple steps of abstraction away from that. So you're not just plotting sort of activity in the histogram, you're plotting some component of the activity that you've established through some long string of processing steps. That kind of makes sense once you think about it a lot, but on its face is really difficult to grasp. Like, why on earth would you plot that on your histogram? I promise it does make some sense, but it unfortunately requires an awful lot of digging to think for that to be intuitive. I think I sort of lost my train of what I was trying to explain there. Yeah.
It's okay. Yeah. I lost you.
Drummond, can you maybe just give a general definition of what you think entropy is?
What I think entropy is?
Yes.
Yeah. So I've heard a number of pretty nice explanations of how entropy works, but one of them that sort of appealed to me, and maybe this is just the way my sort of weird brain works, but I think of entropy as the number of different ways a system can be arranged and still be described as that system. So imagine sand, right? If I have a pile of sand and I sort of shuffle it around a bit, I would still call it a pile of sand. And then I rummage it around again, and it's still called a pile of sand, right? But if I arranged it into a very delicate, like sandcastle, right? And then I sort of just randomly rearranged the grains of sand, the chance that it's still going to be something that I can call a sandcastle is incredibly low, right? And if I sort of press like randomize on the location of all of the grains of sand, 99.999% of the time, I'm just going to call it a pile of sand. But then sometimes I might be like, oh, it looks kind of like a fish, you know, or like, yeah, okay, this could maybe be described as a tower. And so like pile of sand is very, very high entropy in this case, because it's a way of organizing things such that you can or reorganize the component parts in a lot of different ways, and you'd still call it a pile of sand. But then as you get to more and more delicate systems, you know, if it was like a perfect lifelike interpretate like sculpture of Nelson Mandela, right? That's incredibly niche. You know, that like the fact that if that emerged after you just pressed like randomized locations of bits of sand, then that would be, you know, that some sort of godlike power must exist, right? And so that's a very, very low entropy system. So a sandcastle that is a lifelike interpretation of Nelson Mandela is a very, very low entropy system. And a pile of sand is a very high entropy system. So we think about sort of the information density of that system. Does that make any sense at all? Or should I try a different example?
don't know. Does it make sense for you?
We got at least one thumb and then a lot of nothings. So I'm glad I got through to one person, maybe two. All right, sick. It's the problem with entropy is that it's kind of difficult to conceptualize. It's the chaoticness of a system. It's how rapidly something changes. It's how unpredictable something is. You can, you know, someone who has the same daily routine every single day, that's a very low entropy sort of person. But someone who like wakes up and like does a totally different thing, wakes up at a different time, goes to a different job, you know, and eats a different thing for lunch every day, that's a high entropy system. And then we can sort of apply that concept to brain activity. And I appreciate that that is a big leap to go from like this sort of, you guys understand how unpredictability, disorder, chaos works, right? Conceptually and like sort of sociologically, but trying to make a mathematical interpretation of brain activity that is a reflection of disorder or unpredictability is maybe a little more challenging, but I you know, there's a lot of different ways you could do it. Yeah. Did that help? I think so, maybe a little.
Your concept of like unpredictability is a nice angle to understand it, right? Because in the end, the brain is a prediction machine, and all the ways we have reinforced of perceiving our reality and how it's structured in different networks, etc. All that makes our brain and the world more predictable. And as entropy increases, as the connection between networks break down or new connections are being made, things become more entropic, less predictable. People have new insights, blah blah blah, right? So
yeah, okay. So you've just okay. I mean, like, well, I think that was a nice summary. You've taken two leaps there, both of which I'm not sure are totally true. So the first one is that the brain is a predictive, like a machine. Ugh, it's a thing that makes predictions about the world, right? And just because it makes predictions about the world doesn't mean it itself is predictable, right? You're a thing which makes predictions. You're not necessarily a predictable thing. That's a sort of subtle but important distinction there.
I was just trying to marry prediction, connectivity, and information in the sense.
Yeah, totally. And
here, like understand like the steps.
Yeah.
I was just trying to break it down for.
I look, man. I totally. I think it's. I genuinely think your interpretations and your reinterpretations are very much helping everyone. So I appreciate it. The problem with this field, and as you can tell with throughout this, like the somewhat ironically chaotic nature of this presentation, is that I'm really torn between trying to make everything here sort of quite comprehensible and just like intuitive without getting it wrong. Because I think a lot of these papers in the past have said something like, yeah, of course, it's more entropic because you have more ideas, right? Your thoughts are more creative. But then, like, we don't know that. Like, there's no real link between these things. And just because your oxygenation in your brain is more entropic doesn't necessarily mean that like your creative process will be more entropic. So I'm sort of stuck in this space of trying, and this is not to say that like I understand this like perfectly and I'm just trying to disseminate this holy information unto you all, but the problem is it's very, very tempting at every step to make a simplistic interpretation of how brain entropy maps onto either the predictive coding nature of the brain or the entropic nature of the seemingly entropic nature of the conscious experience that is the psychedelic experience, right? As such, I find it very difficult to communicate this project, and I appreciate the opportunity to try and communicate these things with you guys and to hear your interpretations of how poorly I have communicated this in this occasion. Yes, that is all just to say, and again, I'm really not coming at you. It's just to say that be very careful of making these logical leaps between things like the brain entropy is entropic, therefore the conscious experience is entropic. Okay, that's the end of my spiel.
Are there any other questions?
It's really hard to hear.
I'm sorry, I have no idea what you're saying. You're yeah, if you don't mind coming a little closer to the mic.
coming a little bit closer.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah,
Yeah.
do you hear me better?
You are
Okay.
so much louder than the other guy. I don't know how.
Okay. So yeah, thank you for your presentation also. And I had one question. I think I lost it a little bit when you talked about dynamic activity and how like, the entropy changed. So you said like in the short time intervals, you had like an increase in entropy, then like between 5 and 6 seconds, like no real effect. And then like for the longer time intervals, the decrease. But what are the time intervals? Like what are you measuring and how did you decide the intervals? Like what was the design?
Yeah, great. Okay, cool. So when you take an fMRI signal, you get a picture of the whole brain and the activity within each part of the brain every 2 seconds. So you get a snapshot. Effectively, you've got like a 2-second exposure, to put it in camera terms. You have like a 2-second exposure. You take a picture of the brain. Then you have another 2-second exposure. You have another image of the brain. You have another 2-second exposure. You take an image of the brain. So at scale 1, we're looking at the entropy. This image, this next image, this next image, this next image, and so on and so forth, right? At scale 5, what I do is I take the first 5 pictures of the brain and I take the mean of those. And then I take 6 through to 10 and I take the mean of those. And I sort of compress the time series by smoothing across time. Does that make sense?
Yes, okay, yeah.
And then I do the same thing that I did before, where I look at how entropic that new time series is, where the new time series is like a compressed version of the previous time series. And the reason it's 2 seconds, 4, 6, 8, and 10 seconds is because you take a picture of the brain once every 2 seconds. And so that's the time frame I had to work with.
Yeah, okay, now it makes so much more sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for asking the question.
Yeah, so I also said I had 2 questions though, one like more methods question, one more theory. So let's start with the methods one. Can you go back to your overview of all your results?
Mine are the old ones.
Yeah, so I was just wondering what you based your decisions on, which atlas and which parcellation to choose on, because I can see that across a lot of these methods, you've used different atlases or the same atlas with different parcellations. And then, yeah, I mean, for those that don't know, it makes a huge difference if you have a parcellated brain in 5 networks or 20. And if you do that based on 1,000 nodes or 100 or 20.
Yeah, so actually, my answer to this is fortunately super simple. We just used the atlas that the first publication that reported this entropy metric used.
Okay, because
is that smart?
Yeah, I've noticed that in general, that's something that
all of these entropy metrics for each different atlas, right? But we worked out that would take about a year in terms of computing power.
Fair. And the second question was apart from what you started talking about with the different timescales and the multi-scale sample, are there any other preliminary interpretations that you have yourself or your team about how these findings would maybe change our understanding of the entropic brain hypothesis or the Rebus model or something like that?
Yeah.
Any wild ideas?
Yeah, sure. So one of the curious things about this is that we will be the first real publication to show any sort of decrease in brain entropy following psychedelics. I have a sort of cynicism about this brain entropy thing, where the fact that sort of sleep and coma are decreases and that caffeine causes an increase makes me think that brain entropy might not be unique to psychedelia. It might literally just be a measure of how awake you are, right? And when you give people psychedelics, they are super awake, right? Like these people are not going to fall asleep, right? They're like stimulated. Psychedelics cause like dopamine release. People are pretty much awake, right? And before the scan, I mean, these are Danish people who all are like coffee addicted, right? We get them in, we scan them in the morning. They haven't had their coffee because they're not supposed to. They're sleepy. And at the end of the day, they're also pretty sleepy, right? And then we might be looking at a pseudo phenomenon here, where the more psilocybin you've got in your system, the more awake you are. And then all I'm measuring by measuring your brain entropy is just how awake you are. So that is why I interpret the increases in brain entropy quite cautiously, where I'm concerned that I'm just measuring wakefulness. Now, the fact that I can also see decreases in brain entropy, now that's super interesting to me as well. because that doesn't fit with my prior hypothesis that this is just wakefulness that we're measuring. And those are the greatest findings, right? The ones that are contrary to your hypothesis. What we might be looking at here, and I need to look into this a little bit more, is that because the sleep state is characterized by decreases in entropy, I tend to think of the psychedelic experience as sort of like a waking dream, where you have these spontaneous, like it's very dreamlike in a lot of ways, right? You have ego dissolution, you have spontaneous visual imagery, you have strong emotions. There's a lot of sleep-like components of the psychedelic experience, but you're awake. And so what we could, and now I'm being hand wavy, right? But what we could say maybe is something like, yeah, this low scale entropy is wakefulness. So you're awake and you're stimulated, but you're also, your brain is being put into a sleep-like state for these decreases in brain entropy. If I had to do an interpretation, I would say that. But the reason that's not in the slides is because I really need to think about it a little bit more. That makes sense? I have 5 minutes, and I can quickly touch on just some projects that are coming up in the lab if people are interested to hear about those.
Roland, do you have room for one short question?
Yeah. Please. I'd much prefer to answer questions than to talk about my own shit.
A very short question just about your previous statement that if you go back to your slide, ADHD, and I think it was Parkinson. The first slide. The very first one.
This guy.
And because if you associate entropy with awakeness, how do you can I make sense of that ADHD and Parkinson would cause decrease?
Yeah, so I work with a lot of psychiatrists, and I have some respect. I have respect for psychiatry. I think that it is a very emerging field of medicine, and is very, very bad at characterizing what is actually going on within people. So with the ADHD thing, especially ADHD, that is one of the most heterogeneous disorders going. I don't read into it too much. That's pretty much how I feel about the ADHD and the affective disorders findings, the mood disorders. With Parkinson's, there is a fatigue that comes with Parkinson's that is that's well characterized, and so I would expect someone with Parkinson's to be at a lower state of arousal than someone who does not have Parkinson's, and that finding then aligns. But that's neurology, right? Neurology is like when you take psychiatry and you work out what's actually happening, it just becomes neurology.
True. And do you have time for another question? 3 minutes?
Yeah, why not? We'll do questions instead. You guys can read my Twitter if you want to hear about other projects.
We all have different backgrounds in talking about mine. I'm a child neurologist, by the way, and I have zero understanding what you're talking about, but like it's super interesting. I wanted to just ask some maybe stupid question about MRI could be really annoying and loud. How about a functional MRI? Does it also have annoying sound, and how that can influence the experience and even findings and even wakefulness state?
Yeah. So yes, fMRI is also very loud. It's a little different to structural MRI, but pretty much it's the same. We spoke to them a lot. We prepared them a lot. They had a baseline scan, and people generally reported they had a super nice time in there. Like I have a qualitative paper out where we talk about how people felt in the scanner to some extent, and people felt fine. We were kind of worried about doing it in the scanner at first, but honestly, it was great. So I'm not too worried about that. There is a sort of rhythmicity to the scanner as well. It has both a helium pump that has a fixed rhythm to it, but also the scanning sequence has a very to it that people kind of vibed with. So that wasn't really an issue. And in terms of how it changes the interpretation of the findings, we have really like a Heisenberg's uncertainty problem here, where we can only see it by seeing the thing, and so it's impossible to find out the situation without the thing. So I can't really comment on that, I'm afraid.
Thanks. Okay.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions or?
No, I think that's it, Drummond.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot for coming out, guys.
Thank you. Thank you too.
presentation. It was really great.
Yeah, thanks. You guys, if you have my email, feel free to shoot me if you have any questions, or honestly, if you think of something that might be an interesting interpretation of these, please let me know. I would love to hear it. I really value opinions from everywhere. So thank you. This is some other stuff which we won't go into.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Get home safe, and good luck with your exams and everything
Yeah.
like that.
Bye.
Okay, bye now.